what it is it's Satan's controlling the church. The church is not doing its job, and it's not adhering to the teachings of Christ, and it's not adhering to what the Word of God says we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to live. And what they're doing by saying, oh, we have to love these people and take care of these migrants and love one another. This is loving one another. Yes, we are supposed to love one another, but their definition of what love one another means destroying our laws. It means completely perverting what our Constitution says. It means taking unreal advantage of the American taxpayer. And it means pushing a globalist policy on the American people and forcing America to become something that we are not supposed to be.
Yes, folks, that's Marjorie Taylor Greene there. Care for these people. I make a counterclaim that that's Satan speaking. Hello, David. How are you doing?
Hey, man. I know, it's pretty amazing now that it is the Christian church that is too soft and squishy for America's radical right these days.
Oh, okay. I like the impression of the church. It's like, I care about these people.
Lord help us all. We got a fun show lined up for everybody today. In just a little bit, we're going to be joined by Luke Savage, who joined us to talk about his new book, The Dead Center, sort of breaking down the history of liberalism and neoliberalism, where it's going from here, and most importantly, why liberals struggle so much with power. Because for every Marjorie Taylor Greene, there is a Barack Obama and a Joe Biden enabling them to continue to gain support. A little bit later, Matt has a news segment. What do we call it again, Matt?
It's called "What is Crypto Hiding?" And we're gonna maybe have some like a guy with a microscope or something. If anybody wants Credit Weekly and wants to mock up a little, we're trying to make it. Well, I'll explain it briefly. Like every time crypto comes up, it's not only just some like buddy trying to make a quick buck by inflating a bubble. It's also obscuring a real need, particularly of the state to provide a public good. And so that's today's, we're going to be talking about Dr. NFTs. So,
and a bit more in the post game, we have some Elon Musk news. And as always, we'll be taking your phone calls. You can leave them as a voicemail now at 1-940-289-7234. Join us at patreon.com/leftreckoning to get that. And in other announcements, just reminding folks that if you're in the solidarity tier or above, tomorrow we have a happy hour plan for Left Reckoning listeners. That will be at 6 Central. So if you're already subscribed at that tier, you'll be getting information tomorrow afternoon about how to join up for that. I'm really excited to see everybody.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
Well, before we get to all that, Matt, I figured we might take a little visit from Marx expert, Constitution expert, and all-around weird guy, James Lindsay, who has some very interesting things to say about democracy. We have this clip here, courtesy of Sam Holy Brill, and I should note that he did do a little bit of editing just to sort of highlight James's beautiful face. But this is a little interesting segment here that I think is worth breaking down.
In the movement called critical social justice, there are a lot of specialized uses of terminology that people don't always catch on to. So my name is James Lindsay, and I've been writing a social justice encyclopedia called Translations from the Wokish on my website, newdiscourses.com. I want to tell you about the way that the critical social justice movement uses the word democracy, and it may shock you. The word democracy within critical social justice has a presupposition to it. Under critical social justice ideology, in other words, the ideology of creating equity, if people aren't perfectly equal first, then their voice isn't perfectly equal. If you have more money than me, you can amplify your voice. If you have more privilege than me, people might take you more seriously. Therefore, you have more voice than I do if you are in any way above me in privilege or resources. So the only way that we can have a true democratic system, an ideally democratic system, is if everybody is made equal first. In other words, if we have communism. Believe it or not, this is something that's been said by communists all the way going back to Vladimir Lenin. It's been said by the liberation people in the neo-Marxist tradition through the 1950s and 1960s. So within the critical social justice movement. When they say that we have to appeal to or protect or save our democracy, they're actually presupposing that communism is necessary to have democracy in the first place. And if you
So there's a lot in there. I just want to note up top that I think people should be a little suspicious of these kind of new movements of the right. We started out with Marjorie Taylor Greene, basically saying that the Christian church now has become too left, too liberal, too squishy. And now you have, this kind of acolyte of a very confused right-wing movement, James Lindsay, making it seem like democracy is a bad thing. And I want to sort of take us through a little bit of history of thought here, because one of the things that really pisses me off about Lindsay is that not only does he really misunderstand Marxism, or whatever the hell he's calling it's a new term now, right? Social justice, critical social justice theory. He really misunderstands the American, liberal tradition itself. So I want to get to the socialist argument for democracy, because as a socialist, I'm a big fan of democracy. I think that that's something that we should be expanding, not contracting, like James Lindsay seems to be arguing for here. Before we get there, let's at least set the table for why this guy doesn't even understand the traditions that he is supposedly saying that he's standing up for. So very early on in the liberal tradition, there was this kind of threat to any concept of democracy or equal rights. And those were the privileges of old, the privileges of the old aristocracy. And so much, a particular tenet of the American tradition has been to challenge those kind of, lottery of birth privileges that certain people in society get. And that's why we have a system, that was one person, one vote. Of course, that had to be expanded because there's a lot of people who were there cutting out of it. But that was, a very, very key tenet of the system, as was equality under the law, right? This is very, very basic kind of grade school understanding the American system of justice, is that it shouldn't matter how much money you have. It shouldn't matter what titles you hold. The law is something that should treat us all as people first, and sort of ignore all of those other contexts that go into giving us power in the private sphere, right? The public sphere was supposed to be a place where we would meet one another as equal human beings, right? We know the contradictions in American history, but let's just operate from the level of thought. And what's really sinister about what James Lindsay is doing is he's trying to make, criticisms. Again, I don't know what the hell critical social justice theory is. It's nothing that I'm particularly familiar with. I don't think, frankly, it doesn't exist, because he's just pulling together a whole bunch of different people and trying to make it seem like there's some kind of coherent movement here. But I want to just note, some of the words of the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution here, because under the rubric that Lindsay is putting out here, these people too are somehow standing in the critical social justice tradition. So we have this first one up here. This is Hamilton in Federalist 10, where he is making the argument that the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distributions of property. Those who hold those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. And look, when we're talking here, sorry, this is Madison. This is not somebody who is particularly, squishy on these issues. The entire way that they set up this system was because the entire way that, Madison tries to sort of deal with this contradiction in American democracy is by expanding democracy while also sort of getting it as far away from the people as possible. So the idea was you have more and more people buying into the system of government, and then also make sure that the people who were there were as far away from the voters. So things like longer terms, when they're elected into office, things like that, so that they're not as answerable to the rabble. Using the kind of terminology of the day, right? So again, this is not somebody who is like a radical leftist or anything like that. But this is somebody who is looking at society at large and recognizing that, the differences in property that people have do create very different material interests and needs. And he's trying to find a way to mitigate that.
Yeah, no, continue on. I'm just looking up when exactly Federalist Papers 10 was published, 1787. Okay, yeah. Quite a lot of class antagonism happening around that period of time.
And, remember, too, that, the best parts of the American Revolution were the kind of rejection of the power of the king and of, divine right and concepts like that, was trying to create a system of laws that sort of challenged the system of birth. right? And that's something, again, like these aren't radicals. These aren't radicals in the sense of them being socialists or anything like that. But this kind of understanding that you needed to create a system that was treating people equally as individuals was absolutely critical for creating a system that, one, would have the buy-in, and two, would have the longevity, that these people were sort of envisioning.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson did a lot of, I think, early law work against primogeniture, which is the concept of basically the firstborn son inherits all, which was leading to a lot of negative effects and inequality. And so they got rid of it.
Let's go on to this next slide here, because this is another important character. This is Hamilton in writing in a piece called "A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress," who says that Americans are entitled to freedom is incontestable upon every rational principle. All men have one common original. They participate in one common nature, and consequently have one common right. No reason can be assigned why one man should exercise any power or preeminence over his fellow creatures more than another, unless they have voluntarily vested him with it, right? So this, again, is like a very, very crucial thing in the American system. We'll get to some of the critiques that socialists have of it. But this is a very, very crucial principle in American democracy. And anybody who spends some time and respects the thought of these people should be very well versed in these things. And again, what is so sinister about what Lindsay is doing is making it seem like being curious about the question of equal right, being curious about the question of different distributions of property is some kind of new importation into political thought. This goes all the way back to Plato, Aristotle. This is very, very crucial in like Western democratic philosophical thought, for people who were critics of democracy to people who were big proponents of it, and when it comes to the founders, there's a mixed bag. They like democracy for themselves, but they didn't want democracy at large for the people. But this kind of thing that Lindsay, the way he's trying to present it as if this is something that is completely new, I think is very sinister and dangerous. And that's why we want to take a little bit of time to correct the record. Before we zoom out a little bit, Matt, would you put on this last one? Just because I think if we're doing framers and, the kind of folks, who are very critical in creating the American system, let's look at one of the best. That's Thomas Paine, by far. And this is him, I think, saying much better than all these folks, this kind of general principle here, where he writes in The Rights of Man, if any generation of men ever possessed the right of dictating the mode by which the world should be governed forever, it was the first generation that existed. And if that generation did it not, no succeeding generation can show any authority for doing it, nor can set any up. The illuminating and divine principle of the equal rights of man, for it has its origin from the maker of man, relates not only to the living individuals, but to generations of men succeeding each other. Every generation is equal in rights to generations which preceded it, by the same rule that every individual is born equal in rights with his contemporary, right? This is hundreds of years old, this text. I mean, is Thomas Paine, one of these characters in the critical social justice tradition? No, just timeline wise, impossible. So all of this kind of sinister framing that Lindsay's using for people who are engaging in these kind of questions is, again, absolutely cynical. It's ahistorical, and it shows that this guy, despite trying to present himself as somebody who is the grand defender of Western democracy and liberal values, et cetera, is not very, very well versed in those subjects, nor is he very well versed in Marxism or socialism at large. Yeah. But let's talk about this a little bit, because I can go off on this for a little while, because this was like what I studied at. So go ahead, Matt.
I just have one thing to say, like regarding the actual video of like he glosses. How do you not mention, like, let alone I'm really enjoying this. That look way back hundreds of years. Citizens United was what, 2004, 2005, where it was literally the upshot of that is money equals speech, right? So this idea that like, ooh, it's some sort of weird theory that like having more money equals you have a greater voice. Like, no, that's what the Supreme Court literally gave you that formula.
No, I mean, totally. If anything, we, in a lot of ways, when it comes to money and politics, we have actually in some ways gone backwards from some of those original principles. Again, not saying that there was some kind of golden age or era or anything like that, but if you're looking at the way that these people were writing about how they envisioned American democracy to be, they weren't wanting Walmart to be able to sort of buy politicians. They had maybe foolishly this idea that people would take on some kind of civic, personal, moral responsibility to be impartial arbiters, right? Which is one of my criticisms of liberalism and these theories. As well, is that they're not very realistic, as you can see from the decline. But yeah, no, totally. And like, we can do a hell of a lot more on this, and this might be a fun road to take a future whole episode down. But I just want to note, a couple things, right? Liberalism and property, these are things that have always been intertwined. If you read any of the kind of founding documents, if you read Locke, if you read the many different theorists of the Enlightenment who people, sort of associate with the early American system of government, the question of property is always popping up because they understood that this would be a problem, right? If you want to argue that we have equal rights in a public sphere, how can you argue that we don't in the private sphere, right? Where's this line? Where's this delineation? And the liberal understanding of democracy, at least, that we got in the American system, necessitates something like equality before the law, one person, one vote, because they understood that in all previous societies, being able to exercise power over others because of the things that you owned, because of systems of divine right or hereditary powers and privileges, were a direct threat to any kind of democratic system. Liberalism understood this tension, and I think it's worth noting that it did because it is very important for these projects today. But they understood the system, but rather than trying to eradicate that kind of fundamental contradiction, they sought to manage them, which we're going to talk with Luke about this a little bit later. I mean, it's very much a part of this philosophical tradition that instead of trying to, abolish the systems that create these tensions within our society, they figured that they could manage them. And they try to manage them in many different ways through distributing power, through trying to not having direct elections, for example, of senators, and trying to hold power in the arms of the government that were as far away from the general population as possible. But I mean, yeah, look today, like as Matt was just saying, when it comes to property and speech and power, Matt was talking about lobbying, but let's also think about think tank funding, which is a very, very important aspect of the way that rich people are able to exercise their point of view and the things that they want over other citizens. And that's a direct reflection of the money that they have. Now, we're going to make a line here because there are many different traditions, and progressives, they want to change this, right? Progressives rail against money in politics. They rail against, Citizens United, understandably. Socialists don't disagree with that. But even still, like progressives and progressivism is not something that's able to sort of get out of this fundamental contradiction. They just want to manage that tension a little bit better. And don't get me wrong, it would be a hell of a lot better than what we have now. But we're trying to, abolish these systems. And if people are really curious about this, we did a whole episode with Lillian Tuchurchia just a couple of weeks ago. You can find on YouTube about liberal rights and socialism, which I think really paints this picture rather well. But I mean, should we talk a little bit about socialist democracy? Because I've made the case, at least, that this kind of argument that Lindsay is saying that, bringing these things up is necessarily bad or some kind of sneaky importation to try to undermine and create communism, is bullshit. But let's talk more overtly, right? Because again, I always say that I'm a socialist and a big believer in democracy, and my belief in democracy is why I'm a socialist. Because constantly in this society and under this system, you see where those walls are on democracy, right? We're told we are all equal under the law, but you see that there's the stop on that, right? Where does your equality end? Your equality ends the moment that you walk onto the shop floor. Your equality ends when you have to sell your labor, sell your time to somebody else in exchange for a wage. Socialists differ from liberals in their understanding that the problem cannot be managed because this problem eats away at democracy. As I was just noting, look where it stops. Where is the democracy in the workplace? Where is the freedom of the workers to join a union, to have their own personal freedom of speech? Where is that freedom limited in favor of the bosses? Is it a surprise that where that freedom is limited is the place that is the most productive and the most value aspect of society. There's no doubt about it right here, that there was always a limit to this system. And while it was very good at eradicating the kind of old privileges of the aristocracy and of monarchy, it wanted to instill an older system of exploitation and domination for the vast majority of people for the benefit of the very, very, very few. So the things that matter to their bottom line, that's where democracy ends. The Socialist Project is determined to expand democracy, something that Lindsay is clearly stating that is a bad thing. Now, I have a little bit more to get on this, but if we could get back to these slides, I want to go to Marx just for a second, because what Lindsay is saying here is he's talking about equality, right? And making this kind of argument. Again, I can't speak for what is he calling it? Critical social justice warrior philosophy, which again
Hegelo, Marxists, social justice critical race theorists. Yeah.
But I can talk from a tradition that I would say I think I know fairly well, and that's Marxism. And despite what Lindsay says, despite what Jordan Peterson says, socialism is never about trying to create the system of pure equality. In fact, it's treated as laughable. This is a segment from a section from Critique of the Gothic Program, again, to pitch our own stuff. Matt and I did a very long, I think 2-hour episode going through this piece line by line. You can listen to that to get a full extent of the arguments in here. This is not the main focus of the argument, but in this piece, Marx is criticizing a kind of, reformist utopian socialist, quote unquote, program that he found to be extremely unscientific, un-Marxist, utopian, and not something that he would really want to be pursuing. And one of the things that he was arguing against was this argument in the Gothic program for an equal distribution of goods from the labor that is produced, the goods that are produced from workers' labor. And Marx makes this argument that this kind of equality is stupid, utopian, and not ideal. And this is just what Marx says right here about equality. One man is superior to another physically or mentally and supplies more labor in the same time, or can labor for a longer time. And labor to serve as a measure must be defined by its duration or intensity. Otherwise, it ceases to be a standard of measurement. This equal right is an unequal right for unequal labor, right? The point here that Marx is arguing is that under the kind of auspices that were sort of laid out in these utopian socialists of like pure equality, it's something that can never be achieved, and in fact import some of the worst aspects of capitalism into their proposed society. And if you just go to this last slide here, I think Engels lays it out rather well, as he typically does. Marx has a long paragraph following that one, as he usually does. I think Engels does it in a couple sentences here. He says, the real content of the proletarian demand for equality is the demand for the abolition of classes. Any demand for equality which goes beyond that of necessity passes into absurdity. Let me pull these off now. But the argument here is not that we don't want to live in a fair society. We want to live in a society where we're governing ourselves in a true way, rather than this kind of artificial line and wall that exists under capitalism and liberal democracy today, right? And the abolition of classes, right? And what do we really mean by that? The privilege of the ruling class to be able to extract all of the value from the labor of the working class. Once we abolish that, we have no need for these kind of stupid, utopian, and silly management schemes of measuring who's working harder, who's stronger, right? Because those questions become irrelevant. The reason that these things create such tensions in current society is because we're trying to juggle two incompatible concepts, right? The idea that we are all equal under the law, that we are all free people, while also trying to maintain a system of brutal exploitation where you're not free, where your freedom of speech is limited, where your right to assemble is limited, where your right to a vote is limited, right? That is the dictatorship of the bosses. That is the dictatorship of the workplace, right? And Lindsay will never wrestle with these questions because he would much rather try to paint these sinister portraits. But another part where he gets this really wrong is that, Marx and all of this movement is doing it in this kind of pursuit of some perfect equality, which, as I just noted, has been ridiculed by the Marxist tradition. Because
Sorry, just to jump in real quick. This is, if anybody goes back and watches the Jordan Peterson Slavoj Žižek
Yeah.
debate, this is the basic error that Jordan Peterson, because he didn't read shit except the like skimming the Communist Manifesto, and just assumed that this was a position Marx had. But I mean, none of these guys do any of that work.
And look, I mean, it's on us to try to educate people, because that is the common understanding. I mean, that is the grade school question, on your like fill in the blank thing. What is communism? Communism is everybody's equal, right? And it's just not the case. It's anti-Marxist, it's anti-socialist, and frankly, in my opinion, it's anti-human to sort of desire something like that. Because socialism is not about eradicating inequality in this kind of like pure utopian sense. We're all different. We have different skills and motivations, and we want to create a system that tried to eradicate that reality, that just fundamental natural reality would be unnatural and would be immoral, right? So the straw man that they put up, and I think people falsely argue for sometimes, mistakenly argue for because they want to be against whatever James is saying, only adds, to increase this, this misconception. What socialists want to destroy is this system of exploitation that limits our own personal and our social freedoms, while also and allows the few to profit off of the vast personal labor and social labor that goes into production. Only when we abolish that system, only when we say, you know what, these walls that have been put up to say democracy ends here. When you walk into this room, you are no longer a free man, right? You are somebody else's tool to be used. Only when that wall can be broken down can we enjoy a true democracy, the democracy that rightfully has inspired so many people to fight for a better world. And this is not some state of perfect utopia or this silly kind of perfect equality, but it's a system that does not allow either the lottery of birth or the use of state violence or through using personal resources to restrict everyone else's freedom to continue. That's a system that we can call democracy. And it's one that reactionaries like Lindsay and his ilk oppose with every fiber of their being. And it's one that I'm very, very happy to stand for.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of, you're comparing Lindsay and his evident sort of ignorance of the tradition. Where do you think he would have been, in like the 1780s? Because it's easier for me to place a guy like Jordan Peterson, who I think would be. Have you seen the show John Adams?
Yeah, that is a good one.
So this is, I think, where we find Jordan Peterson. Oh,
you're flickering like crazy.
Flickering bad.
But that's fitting of the image, right?
Yeah. But he definitely would be against Thomas Paine.
Totally.
I mean, maybe he could be hospitable to some of the more elitist founding fathers. I mean, which is most besides Paine. I'm not sure. It's hard for me to place them. I know where Jordan Peterson would
I mean, he would have been a loyalist. I mean, no doubt about it. I mean, this is somebody who truly believes in the most absurd hereditary rights. This is somebody who, as we're showing, and I hope convincing folks of, is not even well versed in the tradition that he speaks. He claims to speak for. Whatever it was 200 years ago would have basically been the position that Lindsay would have taken, because he is honestly like the reincarnation of a pure reactionary.
Yeah. And it's funny that you can't just say that. You can't just admit that anymore. You have to hide that somehow.
Yeah. I mean, because like, I know, people get mad when we say this sometimes, but there was like what was being done, what was being argued was extremely limited in the context of the American Revolution versus what we would have liked, and what we would have liked to have seen more of the Thomas Paines, being in charge of these things.
Right.
But it was radical compared to the aristocratic systems of Europe, right? And when Tocqueville came to America, he was completely people always forget Democracy in America, which is a very famous tome most people in college read now, was written from the kind of early standpoint of horror of what's coming for the privileges and powers that people like Tocqueville enjoyed in France, right?
Yeah.
So it is worthwhile remembering that these kind of arguments that were being made, even though they might seem a little bit pedestrian today, we're a bit radical, and it's just like it's not a doubt in my. I don't have a doubt in my mind that Lindsay himself, if he were to be transported back in time, would have been absolutely horrified in the same way that the little fancy boys from France came over to check out this system.
Man, you read like response to the John Brown deal, and it sounds like the hysteria and like the they would have been very. He would have been very, very upset about. I mean, actually, it'd be interesting to see a lot of those guys just talk about that history. Like, would the South have been justified given how aggressively woke the North was becoming about things like slavery? I'd like if they actually got that granular with history, but it's always a sort of weird hodgepodge where you're throwing Hegel on top of like critical race theorists, and yeah.
I mean, we're just, I don't like to have to engage with it because I think it's really silly. But, it's worth getting a little bit of wise to their techniques. And like what he does is he throws a bunch of absurd stuff at you that you get so distracted that you miss the root of what he's saying. And what he's saying right there is that any kind of questioning of property, private property and personal economic power and democracy is somehow against the system that we, have inherited. And nothing could be further from the truth. So I'm happy to stand, I don't know, in the tradition of like the American Revolution while James is sort of standing and doing, weird little odes to the old system of the kings.
Yeah, if it's like Paine versus Burke, I mean, that's very, very simple to figure out who you're lining up behind.
Well, y'all, we got this Luke interview to get to, and it is nutritious. So we want to jump over to that. Just reminding folks, we'll be coming back after the interview to do our segment on crypto, Web3, wild, the new Wild West there. And also to encourage folks to show up for the post-game, patreon.com/leftreckoning. Leave us a voicemail. We always like hearing from folks. And we'll see you all in just a little bit.
All right, cool. And I just want to make sure we're all good because I got a spinning wheel on YouTube. Are we cool, people on YouTube?
It seems like we're good, but I can double check. Okay, I'm getting comments at least.
All right, cool. All right, well, good. Then I will trust the process here a little bit. And we'll see you on the other side of this Luke interviews, folks. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, man.
And joining us once again, Luke Savage. Luke is a staff writer at Jacobin. His words are also a lot of other places. And he is the host of Michael and Us podcast and the author of the forthcoming book, The Dead Center. Luke Savage, welcome to the show.
Cheers. Good to be back.
So I have a few meta things I want to get into about being 90s kids, but let's get to business a little bit. And Dave wants to ask about a previous president, two previous presidents.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think yourself, like a lot of younger lefties, the Obama moment really showed, I think, both like the way that liberalism can be branded in an exciting way. But then also the immediate disappointment. And, you sort of note the role it played in your life. But for people who are still waiting to get their copy of your book, The Dead Center, could you sort of take us through sort of what Obama represented to you early on and then, the disappointments that followed that?
Sure. I mean, I don't think any liberal politician either before or since Obama has been able to replicate what you just described, which was the creation of, really like quite genuine excitement, not just in the United States, but internationally as well. I mean, there was that trip he did to Germany while still a candidate where there were like tens of thousands of people, maybe it was 100,000 people, I don't remember, came out to see him in Berlin, I think. And I wasn't in the United States at the time. I was in my first year of undergrad at the University of Toronto. And the excitement about Obama was pretty much ubiquitous. I remember when CNN announced the result, when they projected that he won, people were literally streaming into the quad, crying and hugging each other. And of course, there were some American students there, but a lot of that was just organic excitement about Obama, because it really did seem like the stars were kind of aligned based on what all of us knew at the time about how political change happens, and what we thought we understood about Obama and what he was trying to do, it all seemed like the stars were aligned for, a pretty sweeping sort of, type of transformation of both American and international politics of the kind that really hadn't happened since, the mid 20th century or something like that. The scale of what we thought was going to happen was really that big. And so when not only did that not happen, but, it didn't happen because Obama clearly didn't actually, that wasn't his ultimate objective from the outset. He didn't actually care about doing that. And if you'd been, if I'd been wiser at the time, I might have recognized that based on a lot of the things he was saying and writing. But considering the scale of what we thought he was going to do and the scale of the disappointment, I think that played a really major role in anchoring a lot of people on the left, because if you were part of that generation, that moment and everything that came after it really forced you to ask, well, if liberalism can't deliver the kind of change we need, what can?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a similar thing going on right now with maybe a freshman who in Biden's first administration. The difference being Trump didn't have 8 years like Bush did, which I think really impacted, because I was a class of 2007 high school grad myself, and I remember the Obama winning was funny because I was in Fargo, North Dakota. And it was a little bit more mixed of the reactions to it. My roommate was a Bush supporter. But I remember, in any college town, pretty much anywhere, you're going to get, I think, we felt like we were in the majority, us who were loved Obama. And I liked Obama mainly because I had a sense that he was anti-war. And then I liked him on Jay Leno 4 years earlier or something like that, right? And that was the extent I was plugged into politics. But it was just something to dunk on the people on our floor who were Republicans in between playing Halo Land and Guitar Hero and stuff like that.
No, the thing is too is that Obama really showed the limitations of that perspective. I think people got a crash course in it, in the sense of he had all this political clay, right? They dominated, they had the Senate and the House. He wins overwhelmingly. There's a national crisis that's going on, which, certainly was, there's a big portion of it that goes to Bush, but that's just a system crisis too, the financial crisis. And then what does he do? He brings back all the same old boys. And plays the same game as all of his predecessors.
Yeah, and it's important. We're talking here about the impressions this made on people, people's personal political beliefs. But it's important, to note here there were also, pretty significant material consequences of the course Obama took, right? Because as you said, David, this was a world historic crisis. This was, I suppose, until the recent COVID recession, this was the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression. And it came out of this, it originated from, this lax regulatory structure in the US housing market, and in the perverse way that the homes of so many working and middle class people had been turned into assets for these huge speculative financial firms. And, even if people didn't understand the kind of nuts and bolts of how that worked, subprime mortgages and all the rest of it, people intuitively did understand, and I think pretty broad way, what was at the root of this crisis. And Obama, deciding to treat it like something that, you could sort of just plug the holes, but you weren't going to, transform the actual, regulatory architecture or anything else that had led to this. It was an extinction level event. I can't remember who used that phrase, but it was called rightly, an extinction level event for the Black middle class. Huge numbers of people lost their homes, a generation of middle class wealth just wiped out in the span of a few years. I think if that hadn't happened, it's, among other things, pretty hard to imagine Donald Trump getting elected. But just this combination of the huge hopes people had, people from all kinds of backgrounds and parts of the United States had for what they thought Obama was going to deliver, and then what ultimately happened. Those two things, I think, are still having a profound impact on American politics and on global politics.
And like, I mean, like I talk about this a lot on the show too, that like, you know, a lot of times like leftists, because a lot of times when people like socialists are thinking about politics, at least in the US, they're really thinking about it in like the context of Bernie 16, Bernie 20, right? And the way that they think about politics a lot is like messaging. It was like, oh, if, you know, Bernie maybe had done like this or that, like his messaging was a little bit better, than we would have went over folks. And I don't necessarily think that's a wrong thing to wrestle with and deal with, but like, you know, our friend Ronan Burtonshaw at Tribune, when he was on our program a few years ago on TMBS, you know, had a line that really spoke to me. Is like, you know, our job as socialists is to convince people that politics can change their lives, right? That like it's a force for good. And like one thing I think a lot is sort of missed from the Obama analysis there is that like it's hard to convince a lot of people, especially older working class people who sort of like lived through the Obama years of like, you know, having that moment of excitement and maybe success that like, oh, look, we can do it. We can take power and then things will change. And then seeing, as we're alluding to, what ended up happening the 8 years later, you know, I mean, was that famous Obama line that he said privately, is like, you know, to a bunch of investment folks. I can't remember exactly what cohort he was speaking to, but he says, I'm the only thing that stands between you and the pitchforks right now. Yeah. Right. Like, you know, and that's how he saw his role at that kind of pivotal moment. And, you know, there's a lot of like rightful and understandable pessimism that a lot of people have about politics, I think directly falls out of like the Obama era sort of, you know, swindle, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure I really have anything to add to that, but I certainly agree.
I mean, what do you guys think about Obama's current? It seems like he's doubling down on that. Like, he's not going to learn anything or even fall back. He's going to continue that project, right? Like, I heard recently he's upset that his administration was proposed as sort of a what not to do for Biden as far as like going small. And that's why you got like at least early indication that maybe Biden was going to do more than they wanted to. And Obama hated that. And he got, I mean, like, and any intervention he makes in politics to me seems to be bad and sort of like anti-small d democratic, frankly.
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that's clearly been guiding Obama more than anything else, I mean, I think his overriding objective since leaving the White House is preserving his legacy as a kind of world historic figure, even though he, you know, very visibly didn't change a lot about U.S. politics in the way people thought. I mean, you know, I'm sure he had deeper ideological objections to Bernie Sanders. Of course he would, but I think he also had, or I think he had and has an investment, as that Biden story you just told clearly indicates. You know, he has an investment in always representing the outer edge of what is possible in, you know, liberal politics. Because if somebody goes beyond what he did, with all of his, you know, eloquence and communication skills and popularity and his 60 votes in the Senate and majority in the House, et cetera, if somebody goes beyond that or gets people excited and about some alternative to it, you know, he's no longer the great grandee of the Democratic Party. He's no longer the sort of JFK FDR hybrid or whatever he sees himself as. And, you know, he's, I think, made much more of an effort than a lot of ex-US presidents, really any other, to remain visible. You know, I mean, George H.W. Bush, I think, started this tradition of just going out and just being totally cynical and speaking to, you know, banks and oil companies and getting paid, you know, $500,000 for a 30-minute speech about nothing. Obama's continued that, right? But he's also expanded the role of being an ex-president into all this strange stuff he does, where he kind of curates middle-brow lists of media for people, or rather, you know, his staff curate these lists that they're then sort of put out. You know, it really is a kind of Obama Inc., which I don't think anyone else has really tried before. And it's all deeply cynical. I mean, I think as he's left the White House, he's only become a more cynical figure. And of course, you know, the main defense of Obama that you usually hear is that, well, he wanted to do all this great stuff, but there were all these, you know, awful constraints. You know, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans wouldn't let him do, the kinds of great things that he wanted to do. Well, he's out of the White House now. You know, he's not under any of those constraints. And, you know, if anything, I think he's only kind of moved, you know, rightward in his trajectory, and he's only grown kind of more cynical as a figure. You know, he's not out championing big important causes, right? He's He's making Netflix documentaries where he talks about how national parks are important. He's putting out lists of sort of middle-brow books and top 40 music you're supposed to, consume. He's hanging out with celebrities. That's what he's doing.
Yeah, I honestly remember having discussions with folks back during the Obama administration where that now make me cringe, and I'm just remembering it, of people thinking, oh yeah, he's going to have an exciting post-presidency. And like you can convince yourself based on like the Iran deal and maybe like thought of Cuba, like maybe he's just going to be unleashed. And it's like, not so much. And you do a good job of, I think, damning him for making idealism, I think you put it, like synonymous with platitudes or something like that. Like, because really, like, he was talking a big game about transformational change. And like, I mean, he really like sort of stretched out the sweater, if you will, or something.
I think he's somebody who's thought more deeply about rhetoric, the enterprise of political rhetoric than any other, liberal politician, certainly in our lifetimes. I mean, in the book, I go into the essay on Obama, which is by far the longest essay in the book. I talk about how, once you've read enough of him, once you've listened to enough of his speeches, you kind of realize that he has a move, like he has a shtick that he's doing over and over again. And it has it's tremendously effective rhetorically. He likes to set up these perceived oppositions between people, ideological tendencies, big concepts, historical forces, whatever it is. And then he kind of gradually like whittles away through sort of a process of like dialectical opposition and kind of odd synthesis. He whittles away any distinction, right? This was the famous, there's no red and blue America speech. So it's very effective because what it does is it allows almost anybody to see their experience or their perspective reflected in Obama's, in his self, in his image. And so it's kind of a mile wide and an inch deep in terms of all the kinds of things it captures. And that's, far more effective, I think, than what most politicians do, right? Most politicians, especially liberal ones, they're always trying to capture as big they're always trying to speak in platitudes and be vague to capture as many people as possible. And by doing that, they actually demotivate a lot of people, right? Because hearing most people do that, it's pretty boring. Obama figured out a way to give that enterprise, which is just the same one that every hack, politician's been doing since time immemorial. He figured out a way to give that like this sweeping epochal character, such that you listening to it, if you were motivated by him and you were sympathetic to him, you felt like you were hearing this kind of grand sermon about the future. Although, of course you weren't.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just on this, because in a second I might want to talk about, the track record for like liberals in power, but just so we're sort of operating from, the same kind of terminology. I mean, obviously it's a big subject, a lot of history, but, could you give people an understanding of what you sort of mean when we're talking about, liberals or liberalism at large?
Sure. I mean, I suppose there's a couple things I'd say about that. I mean, when I use those things in my book, they're mostly a shorthand for, what has been, I guess, the prevailing tendency in global politics since roughly the early 1990s, right? So when the Democratic Party is fully transformed by the Clintonites, when the British Labour Party is taken over by, Blair and Brown, and more broadly, I suppose, when the global order really shifts away from what had been the sort of prevailing direction of travel since 1945, when it shifts away from that into, what we now broadly call neoliberalism, where, everything is about the spread of markets. Everything is about commodifying more and more parts of everyone's daily lives. Politics are increasingly kind of technocratic and managerial. There's more I could say on that, but that's broadly speaking what I usually mean. Although, of course, when we talk about liberalism, we're also talking about, a philosophical tradition that goes back to, the 17th century. And, that's talked about less in the book because, only got so many pages to work with. But I guess sometimes when I talk about liberalism, I'm referring to that as well.
Well, this might be a good occasion to play our clip of Bill Clinton here. And if you could, after set the table for what the context of Bill making this pronouncement was, which I mean, even before I was involved in like paying attention to politics, I remember this as like a quote that was trotted out.
I think I know what's coming.
We know big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem. We know and we have worked to give the American people a smaller, less bureaucratic government in Washington. And we have to give the American people one that lives within its means. The era of big government is over. But we cannot go back to the time when our citizens were left to fend for themselves.
Right. So, I mean, that just, it's very emblematic of where the Democratic Party moved in the 1990s, right? You know, they were no longer even pretending to be an alternative to, what Ronald Reagan had established. They were, copying, they were taking the Republican Party's themes and kind of rhetoric about the role of the state, and they were just using it. They weren't just deferring to it; they were, embracing it. And that I think has been, particularly among American liberals, that has been the sort of basic move ever since. It's not just on the role of the state; it's on all kinds of things, which I guess are connected to the role of the state. I mean, tax policy, public spending, welfare programs, even, in the 90s, racial justice, which of course, Joe Biden was, or I should say racial injustice, in the 90s when, the big mass incarceration bill was, pushed quite actively by Joe Biden. I mean, that was also coming out of, moral panics, with, racist subtext or text, going back to at least the Nixon era and before. So, Clinton really perfected this type of triangulation, and in the process, he reoriented the Democratic Party away from some of the constituencies that had sustained it since the New Deal and towards this kind of more affluent, suburban constituency, which is increasingly, when Democratic politicians are talking, that's increasingly who they're addressing, and you can really see that when you listen to them talk.
The funny thing about that era of big government quote is at the end of it, he says, but we can't return to the times where we let everybody fend for themselves. And like that little addition to that, it reminds me of like the West Wing sort of brain essay in your collection here, where it's like, first of all, like, no one's going to remember that because it's not what's going to happen. You're like making yourself feel good as if, and it's just like really cringeworthy, I think, after this line.
Right. I mean, so in copying Reaganism, he's also still he's also triangulating the other direction. He's saying, well, I mean, I just embraced Reaganism, but also I'm not really doing that. I mean, it's like, it's so, it's so transparently cynical. Actually, there's one other thing I'll say about that speech, because no one remembers another aspect of that speech. This is mentioned in a later essay in the book, but that speech where Clinton is proclaiming famously, the end of, we're getting government paternalism off your back, et cetera. He also, there's also a bit about, putting V chips in TV sets so that content will be made more wholesome for children. Mm-hmm. There's, he appeals to like Hollywood studio producers to make, programming, make movies and stuff that are more reflective of, I think, family values and, that kind of thing. So there's all this rhetoric about government paternalism, but, he was also copying the kind of, or, at least borrowing from the sort of repertoire of social conservatism from the Reagan era as well, right? Like all these kind of absurd panics from the 1980s about, started by, right-wing evangelicals, especially the so-called moral majority, about how, society was falling apart because of the stuff on TV, the stuff on the radio. So that's why we need to ban books. We need to, have V chips in our TV sets, all that kind of thing. So Clintonite triangulation was like pretty considerable, and it wasn't just around economic issues. It was around all kinds of things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dave and I were talking about that. Like, we're going to be it's the era of small government or something now. Except the government's going to get into the prison business to the extent that we're the largest cager of humans on planet Earth. But except for besides that, it's era of big government's over.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting bit of history though, because I think that very much you can make the argument, I mean, rightfully, that this through Clinton and then Blair in the UK, that this is the triumphant moment of neoliberalism, right? And you see it across the board. This is this big movement for deregulation, destroying and waging war on the welfare state. While also relying extremely heavily on polling, right, and going whichever way the wind blows on things. That becomes very, very much, that's what Clinton's famous for more than anything. And the real irony of all of this has to be, there was all this triumphalism that you saw after this. And it still operates as a kind of common logic. And, this when you're sort of doing your media criticism in the book as well. That all this was sort of done under the promise that we're going to do this to basically ensure that this party stays in power and is the dominant party in American politics forever. And look, it's 2022. We've seen that hasn't actually been the case. That despite all of the favor, despite all of the opportunity, at least in the United States, for the Democratic Party to basically become the party because of social changes and things like that. The Republican Party has just sort of continued to thrive, frankly, despite, all of these, this sort of turning your back on the left and turning your back on labor. And this was supposed to allow you to sort of win forever, be able to maybe not do everything that y'all want, but, they can get enough done. That hasn't been the case. It hasn't been a very successful track record, even by their own kind of sales pitch.
I mean, it's crazy when you go back to the 1990s, just how kind of triumphant the rhetoric was, and just the whole culture at the time, across the board was consumed by this idea that, liberalism was going to be hegemonic basically forever, and that the kind of pattern of events that had been set into motion in 1989 was just going to continue, right? I mean. History itself was over, as the now infamous phrase at the time proclaimed, and as an extension of that, right, liberal parties were either going to be in power forever, or the parties that occasionally kind of swapped governments with them would have to operate within the consensus they'd established. And not only did that not happen, right, but the actual consensus itself. Basically, you could say to some extent, is ruptured by 9/11, but it really comes apart with the financial crisis, Mm-hmm. So, generously speaking, you can give it 10, maybe 15 years. It wasn't, it lasted far less than, Keynesianism did after the Second World War. It was hardly an impregnable kind of, way of organizing the world, and it's been prone to, increasingly since 2008, just constant implosions and disruptions, by design, because it's actually not a good way, just letting multinationals and finance kind of structure global politics and neutralizing democracy on both a national and international level. Guess what? That doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm curious what you think about this, because, I want to talk, you make a good note about state level politics in your book, because a lot of the arguments, a lot of the counter arguments we have to deal with these Republicans, and the Republicans are anti-democracy, and we haven't always had the perfect experience to try this out. Right. Which again, I think, I don't know if I'd give that to them, but even if you give it to them, you have, a couple examples of states, New York and California, as examples of states that have been dominated by the Democratic Party. And you only have to look at those, as sort of models of the failure of this worldview. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and also note something that Matt and I have been noticing. We called Biden the press release president at first, right? When everyone was getting really excited about Biden in his early days, because he would come out with a statement that, you then get these kind of like triumphant pieces, even from a lot of like, left liberals on that, like, we're in a new era because Biden acknowledged this, right? Biden would say climate change is like a race issue, right? And everyone's like, oh, Biden finally gets it. Well, then you actually look what he's doing. He's very happy to acknowledge it. Cuomo, I like the note that you have about Cuomo and Newsom. When they're talking about climate change, they're just sort of like nice pleas from somebody that you might think is sort of like on the outside, say like, we need to do something, rather than people who are in control of very powerful and wealthy states.
Yeah, I mean, so that argument, which features in, I guess, a few places in the book, but there's an essay about Canada and what kind of it can teach us about liberals more generally, and or liberals around the world, but American liberals in particular. That essay was partly inspired by a great chapter in Thomas Frank's book Listen Liberal, which is called The Blue State Model. And I mean, he makes this point very persuasively, right? There are all these states that are liberal fortresses, and none of them are kind of Scandinavian social democracies, right? They're anything but. They have huge problems, not only with economic inequality. Some of them actually lead the United States in terms of material inequality. They have huge problems with racism, political corruption, police violence, you name it. And so liberals in those states are not using the power that they have, often in super majority power. They're not using it in the way that national Democrats claim, well, hey, we would use our power this way if we, if you'd give us the power. In fact, they often do the very opposite, right? Andrew Cuomo formed a special caucus so that he could pass Republican budgets in a state that was blue from top to bottom. So at a certain point, we really have to understand that liberals are not, it's not that they've suffered all these defeats and all this political retrenchment. And they would do all this great stuff if, they had enough votes, or if the country was just less politically conservative or whatever. Fundamentally, liberalism is a small c conservative project, at least in its, present day incarnation. If you go back to the, 19th century, the 18th century, it's had radical incarnations, right? In the United States, I suppose, one of the more radical periods is the one defined by FDR's kind of populist brand of liberalism. But none of that is anywhere to be found today, right? It's a managerial project. It's not trying to transform society, and insofar as it has any kind of wider conception of social justice, it's just about, as you were saying, you make statements, you make declarations, you appeal to things. It's all about language. It's about style. It's about aesthetics. It's about, how certain groups are represented within a structure that remains hierarchical and unjust. And, all of the arguments I think people still make in defense of liberalism to that end are belied by, what happens, what we've seen over and over again happens when liberals, have the authority, have the power, have the votes to do things. They still don't do it.
And I just, this critique means a lot to me, as a Texan, as someone, who lived most of my life in the South, because obviously look, Abbott and the people in control of this state are terrible. And we want to get rid of them, no doubt about it. But I get worried sometimes, just because it does feel like the deck is stacked against us, that there is this kind of, tacit acknowledgement you get sometimes from Southern or red state or, lefties that what we need to do is create a period of Democratic Party, hegemony within these states. And then we can finally have the final conflict. And I'll just say that for the people who I love, that's, disastrous in the sense that we need to get healthcare for people. We need to make sure that people can stay in their homes. And two, as a thesis, it hasn't really borne out a lot of, the kind of rewards that are promised for people. And I think it would be a tremendous historical mistake if we were able to build up the, political power in places like Texas or South Carolina or wherever to overthrow the GOP that we just sort of replaced it with very milquetoast, coastal liberalism.
That's right. I mean, I feel like I've been hearing throughout my entire adult life, ever since I, got interested in politics as a teenager, some version of the argument that, you may not like it, but triangulating and sort of, pivoting to the center that's the savvy thing. That's the pragmatic thing, because, politics is the art of persuasion. You have to meet people where they are. And that means always meeting them, kind of a notch to the right of the center, and I've seen over and over again that, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in a kind of longer term way in terms of reversing the kind of wider trends we've been talking about, but it doesn't even work in a short term electoral way, because, triangulating doesn't motivate people. It doesn't give them a reason to be switched on to politics. And that's one of the reasons why, often what you have now is, political activism, such as it exists in a mainstream way in the United States, right? It's just people who are kind of political junkies. They like watching cable news, and they just cheer for one side or another. It is almost like sort of sports with infotainment thrown in. And so, like, most people are not ever going to want to be involved in that kind of partisanship, right? Like, to get people engaged, they have to feel like they're actually being represented, and they have an interest that is central in some way to the project that they're a part of. And that you can't do that if if you wage politics, if you conduct politics in this really top down, heavily professionalized way where everything's focus grouped, and politicians are always trying to communicate in sort of the vaguest and broadest way possible. It just doesn't work. And it especially doesn't work. And, Texas is certainly relevant here for the reasons you said. But it's, relevant more broadly as well, right? Like, it doesn't work to stop the right. The whole claim is that this is what we have to do to stop, the right, which in Texas, especially with all, these bills lately is especially, terrifying. But at the end of the day, you can't beat that through triangulation. At least, once in a while, you might win an election, but it's not going to stop the overall trend. To do that, it requires, a richer political imagination and, a more kind of bottom up kind of strategy.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And the hyper focus on winning over fairly conservative suburban wealthy people is just not a strategy for the future.
Yeah.
I can't help but be reminded. Maybe we should talk about Beto here, David. Yeah. But it just reminds me of in the face of GOP just restricting voting just to beat the band. They're saying we're going to out-organize that. It's just that's democracy is something that you have to cultivate and protect, and not something that you can just sort of be like, oh, well, I guess that limb's been hacked off. We'll just figure it out. But let's talk about Beto a little bit before we move over to the Vision for Hart. How do you pronounce the name of that town? Hartlepool?
I think it's Hartlepool.
Hartlepool, yeah. Right? Okay.
Yeah, I'm curious. You have a great piece in there about Beto mania, and it is funny because I was saying to a couple of people earlier that he's running for governor now, and there is a retro element to his campaign, even though his Senate campaign was only a couple of years ago, and it's just he's a strange candidate because despite the way that he was presented, particularly in 2020, as the young, maybe even more radical than Bernie Sanders, maybe, kind of character, he's shown himself to be somebody who really will go whichever way the wind blows. Title 42, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but, that's a pretty racist rule that was put into the Trump administration to restrict immigration to this country. It's why they shut down the border here. Abbott shut down the border here in a big political stunt because they don't want to get rid of, their current ability to be able to turn people away, asylum seekers away at the border. And Beto, to his credit, had spent the past couple of years being very critical about it. But then when the moment comes, when the rubber hits the road on it, he says, "Yeah, I think it's irresponsible actually to rescind Title 42, right?" Which I don't know if anything that's a preview for what a Beto governorship or presidency would look like. Could you talk a little bit about what you sort of gathered from him in the 2020 campaign and the way that he was treated by the national media? Because I think It really does show like a fundamental disconnect of both like Democratic Party like leadership, but more strikingly like Democratic Party like media figures.
Oh yeah, I mean they thought and they still think that the way to win an election and the way to succeed politically is just to dangle, shiny objects in front of people, shiny new personalities who can be these carte blanches onto which, people can project whatever. And they're kind of copying Obama in that, or they're trying to copy Obama and not succeeding, right? In 2020, they rolled out, just personality after personality, and, none of them caught fire. All of them were trying to be an Obama, right? And it didn't work, right? Kamala Harris invested her entire campaign in, not campaigning in early states and instead trying to have these viral debate moments. Like it's all about, it's people who've watched too many, Jon Stewart owning, Fox News or whatever, or too many, Jed Bartlett owning, people in the West Wing with a single speech. And they think that that's a political strategy. And the O'Rourke campaign was especially notable in this sense because, it lasted about, I want to say 3 months to be generous. Like the window where anybody took seriously the idea that Beto O'Rourke was going to be the Democratic frontrunner in 2020 lasted from roughly, I think, the end of 2019 until, it was earlier than that, right? It was like the end of 2018 into 2019, or I'm forgetting exactly when he dropped out. But by the time that famous Vanity Fair profile came out, like his star, I feel like was already kind of falling. He didn't have, the magic such as there had been any from his Senate campaign was not really translating. And it really did seem to think that, certain pundits and Democratic operatives thought that if they sort of just said that, well, this guy's the new Robert Kennedy, he's the new Obama, he's whatever, that was gonna catch on. And his candidacy turned out to be unbelievably awkward. Like just his weird slam poetry that he posted on Medium.
And he's like standing on every table he could find.
Yeah, inexplicably, streaming his dental surgery that time. All this weird stuff. If you reread that Vanity Fair profile, some of the passages are just cringeworthy beyond, words, like stuff about his being quintessentially Generation X and being raised on Star Wars and punk rock and a healthy suspicion of authority and, that kind of stuff. Just painting, these broad kind of generalizations about this guy and his politics and what he represents based on just the most superficial observations about like the bookshelf in his house and stuff like that. So Beto O'Rourke, I think, was an example of how invested a lot of liberals still are in this template, and also how unsuccessful it is unless you happen to have the unique political talents of Barack Obama or perhaps a Bill Clinton, which obviously, O'Rourke, Buttigieg, and others trying to copy this mold, definitely don't have.
It's been funny, like, just like because, I think you can imagine, but he really burned a lot of goodwill here. When he ran for president, because people were like, if he seemed like he was going to be the kind of champion to push back against GOP dominance in the state of Texas, it was just, people felt very betrayed that the first thing he did was run as far away from Texas as possible to go campaign the country.
Well, right. And what did people actually like about Beto in 2019? I'm sure his appeal was, broader than the people that I saw on, Twitter and people I talked to. But it seemed to me that one of the big things that motivated excitement around him was the fact that people kind of thought that he had sort of Bernie-ish politics. There's a lot of, youth excitement in his campaign. There was this feeling that, he spoke kind of authentically and that he wasn't going to triangulate, in the face of a really loathsome opponent like Ted Cruz. He was actually going to, kind of stare the right in the face and, object on kind of, moral grounds to their arguments. And he just didn't do that at all. Like, what was Beto O'Rourke's, Senate campaign about besides Beto ultimately, and what was his presidential campaign about? I guess the policy thing that if anyone remembers anything, people can recall was where he just like brazenly was like, damn right, we're going to come to your house and take away all your guns, which I don't imagine, by the way, is serving him very well in the gubernatorial election.
Well, now he likes guns. Which has been pretty funny. So,
damn right, we're coming. Actually, he's like, damn right, we're coming for your guns, and we're going to take them out shooting. I
mean, like, and like to give him credit in his Senate run, he did something that I did respect, where he didn't just stay in like Democratic Party strongholds. He said, I'm going to go and visit every county. But again, like, while that's something the Democratic Party should just be comfortable with doing, like, as an intervention, like, it's actually not as like radical as like you would think, right?
Well, right, and visit every county to say what? I mean, like, I don't remember what he was saying. He was driving around and like going up on tables and like saying God knows what. Like, I don't think he wasn't going to every county and like spreading the gospel of like universal health care or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, should we go across to the UK for a second? Because, like, one thing that I think, like, I don't know, as somebody who follows, politics pretty closely, there is a understandable kind of position a lot of people have where it's like, well, these things are contingent. They're contingent on like the very specific historical, geographical, areas where they come from. And I think this kind of neoliberal model is fascinating, and I think you can call it a theory, right? Or it works because it works in the United Kingdom, it works in France, it works in Greece, it works in Germany, it works in the US as well. And this clip here we have of Owen Jones. You have it up, Matt. Thank you. Yeah. Is quite good because it's showing him. He's in Hartleby, right?
Hartlepool.
Hartlepool, excuse me. All those British words are a little confusing me sometimes. But here he is. He's speaking. Owen Jones is speaking with a Labour candidate who's trying to put forward Labour's plan for the region, right? Trying to say we have a particular demand and need for our area. And let's see what he has to say here.
Let me know if this sound doesn't work.
Don't use any platitudes when you answer this. What is Labour's vision for the country now? What does Labour stand for? Don't say fairness and everything being nice and mother had an apple pie. What is it concretely? What's the vision?
People in this election aren't talking though about Labour's vision about Labour's vision for the country. They're talking about Labour's vision for Hartlepool.
Well, it's both. But okay, what's Labour's vision for Hartlepool? That's unique and different and distinct.
Yeah. So the best companies come to Hartlepool to provide the best jobs because we have the best trained people.
Do the Tories disagree with that?
Because we've invested in people right from the start of life, and you make that difference to children. So by the time they start school, they're not behind their peers. They can read. They can. You then have small class sizes and really good. My kids are at primary school, and they say that the class sizes are large. Their head teacher talks to me about cuts in schools and having to reduce teaching assistants. So you help the most vulnerable children. You help children with special educational needs. And when kids are, aren't coming to school, you send out support workers to find out what's going in the household, and you help people to get to a point where they can have really great skills, really great training, and then employers come to you not because you've got the lowest taxes, because you've got the best people. There's some direct things. That's why I'm in politics.
But do you?
The first thing that comes out of his mouth is the best businesses. And the entire reason for, I guess, educating and like making sure people aren't impoverished or in want is so that you can ultimately attract an employer. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, I mean, where to even begin with that? I mean, there's two things that are happening in that clip, which, is pretty unforgettable. I mean, just as like far as train wreck interviews go. I mean, I think probably in the most charitable reading, that guy, I've already forgotten his name. I think it might have been Williams. He was ultimately unsuccessful. Would you believe it that the people of Hartlepool were not, bowled over to get out and vote in droves for that agenda where kids can read? But a charitable interpretation is that's a guy, a local guy they found to run, and he's not comfortable with, talking like a politician. And Owen asked him a substantive question, right? And he panicked. But I think it's undeniable that the other thing that's certainly going on there is that he's unable to articulate a vision because the Labor Party in its current incarnation doesn't have one, right? There's no, if you were asked to define the Labor project under the leadership of Keir Starmer, I think the only things you could say substantively would be negative, right? They'd be about what the Starmer project is not, namely, the very popular agenda, popular with Labour members and with the British public, that was championed by the previous leadership, right? The big fight that I guess happened after this at the Labour conference sometime last year involved Starmer trying to change the rules in future Labour leadership elections so that it would be harder for a future candidate like Jeremy Corbyn to get on the ballot. I mean, think about what an incredible statement that is about the current leadership of the Labour Party, that they were investing their political capital in changing the rules that were going to determine how their successor was going to be chosen, right? In terms of a positive political vision, like there just isn't one, or not one beyond the one we just heard that poor fellow rather awkwardly try to articulate. It's just there's just a very kind of generalized orientation towards, well, we're going to make things better. We're going to support education and business. We're going to, support community. Like it's just the vaguest, broadest kind of rhetoric there is. And that's because the Starmer leadership is not really trying to pursue a coherent agenda. It's despite running, I mean, Starmer only got elected leader because he basically promised that he was going to continue much of the previous leadership's agenda, but he hasn't done that. He's mostly spent his political capital on fighting the left in the Labour Party and on kind of signaling to British capital and the Tory, mostly Tory dominated press, that he's not really going to threaten them in any serious way at all. And, again, kind of similar to what we were saying about Texas. I mean, that might be a strategy that once in a generation, a guy like this, just a total, centrist dullard, maybe under the right circumstances, he gets lucky and he wins an election. Usually I think that's not going to be the case. And, no matter what, doing this is never a way to build long-term power. It's not a way to build constituencies of voters that last, or activists that last from one election, to the next. Labour under Jeremy Corbyn had, I don't even remember what the peak was, but I think it was over 500,000 members signed up. So at a time when, participation in political parties is really probably lower than it's been at any point since the Second World War, suddenly the Labour Party in the post-Tony Blair era was the biggest mass party in Europe, and it's lost hundreds of thousands of members since Starmer took over, and I think that's been quite intentional. The goal here is not to champion an agenda or a particular vision of society. It's to triangulate until circumstances allow you to kind of sneak by, and then once you're in government, you just kind of manage things in a very technocratic way, and in doing so, lay the foundations for the political right to get even scarier and more dangerous.
Yeah, I like your point that is like the response to that guy is pity. Like, this is the sort of program he has to run, right? A replacement level politician, like, you want to give them something a little bit more like an enemy, for instance, like that sort of stuff. And he's got, it's like cargo cult mentality, basically.
Totally. Well, I have, I know we're going a little long, but there's two quick things I wanted to get to before we let you go, because I'd be sad if we didn't at least visit. One of my favorite chapters in the book was your chapter, David Brooks's Capitalist Fatalism, right? Where you're responding to an essay of his called "I Was Once a Socialist, Then I Saw How It Worked." And in that piece, Brooks goes on to sort of, flex his real lefty socialist credentials, which, just as a side note, I'm curious, what y'all think about this. Always really funny when kind of older liberals will do this to me, where they'll be like, well, when I was your age, I was a socialist. And then you really try to, it's like, oh, well, that's sort of exciting. Maybe we have something to talk about a little bit. And then you start to actually try to figure out what they mean by that. And it's very, very ethereal, right? That Brooks's like socialism seems to be, frankly, almost made up.
Chiron.
but not particularly deep at all. But, the crux of his argument, I would just like to hear your response to this, Luke, is that, all these things that we think as socialists are all well and good, but there is we're naive, right? We don't understand how the world actually works, and the world works by a certain logic that we then have to, try to add maybe some of our convictions to, but just know that you're just going to be extremely disappointed. I mean, how would you respond to that kind of, canned argument that we get a lot from older liberals?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and I think, when it really comes down to it, so much of what animates, liberalism today, which, as I said, is functionally small c conservative. David Brooks, again, he's a conservative, but I mean, practically speaking, he's a right-leaning liberal, right? So much of what animates that kind of politics today just is that if you strip away all the artifice, all the rhetoric, all of the arguments, all of the policy commitments or lack thereof, what you're left with is just this deep-seated belief that things can actually really get better and that there's no point in trying. Now, I don't know what Brooks's own personal trajectory towards that conclusion has been. I mean, for a lot of older liberals, people that might support the Democratic Party, might even read a magazine like The Nation, the way they arrived at, supporting Hillary Clinton over Bernie in 2016 was actually just, seeing Mondale lose and seeing Dukakis lose and maybe even seeing, Nixon quash McGovern in 72. With someone like Brooks, I'm not sure what to make of, how he got there, because his account of his own trajectory is so disingenuous. He gave a version of this as a speech in Toronto, actually, which I saw. He was debating Yanis Varoufakis, and he and Arthur Brooks got absolutely owned by Varoufakis and Katrina vanden Heuvel of The Nation. But yeah, Brooks mentions this specific clip where he says, well, I turned against the left when I was in this debate with Milton Friedman, and I just had no answers, to his questions. And I went back and found the clip, and, what you can find is that Brooks, who's, a bespectacled 23-year-old, is making these pretty limp sort of like 70s liberal arguments, but he does not seem to have any kind of, deeper, left convictions. And he's certainly not socialist. I think he was already working at the Wall Street Journal, and like a year or two after that, he moved over to, I think, the National Review. So it's really hard to tell in what sense he was ever a socialist. He seems to be trying to limply argue for a kind of New Deal liberalism and doesn't have a good response to it. But I guess, or it doesn't have a good response to Milton Friedman, I should say. But I guess what I would say about the wider issue here is that I just don't think it's. I don't think on a philosophical level, I don't accept the premise that the world can't be made better. And I mean, if we're limiting ourselves to just the United States, that the United States can't get better. I mean, I remember in that debate, I can't remember if it was Varoufakis or vanden Heuvel made the point that, like, well, there are countries that, have capitalism, but they're far more egalitarian than the United States. So, would you support, institutions like some of those that exist in Scandinavia, being adopted in the United States? And he kind of waffled on that. And he just said, well, they have those for cultural reasons, and culturally, I don't think those could work in the United States. But, those institutions and many others, including some which still exist in the United States, are clear evidence of, the power of, political change, different kinds of political institutions, their effectiveness in making society more just and more equal, right? I mean, before the 20th century, the welfare state didn't exist, right? No one had conceived of it. And during the 20th century, I think it's pretty incontrovertible that the welfare state improved, countless lives and gave, huge numbers of people an opportunity to flourish and, develop themselves and, have more free time and just have richer and fuller lives. And, there'd never been anything like that before in human history. So I just don't accept that argument. Yeah. I mean, for someone like Brooks, it might come out of almost a religious conviction. I mean, I think that is, there's like conservative Christianity is a big animating force on the right. And so Brooks may just be borrowing from that some sense that, we're fallen creatures, and that's why we have to gut welfare programs and cut Social Security. But I don't accept that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know the limitations of that argument always sort of frustrate me a lot. But I want to ask you just briefly, just because, you've written this book. We've lived through some pretty wild times, financial crisis, COVID crisis. We saw this exciting kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, left populism movement in the United States with Bernie, United Kingdom with Corbyn. You've seen Syriza. You've seen all these different formations that have sort of risen up, and they've done a lot, but they didn't necessarily take state power, except in the case of Greece. We've talked about how liberalism, hasn't delivered and hasn't been successful in the metrics that it puts out. But at the same time, it feels like that movement, again, even though it might not be, delivering, still feels very, very, cemented, or at least in the sense that like it's here to stay, right? Despite all these things that we thought they might have to change their playbook a little bit because of the shifting material realities, they haven't. I mean, Joe Biden, I think, is the perfect example of this. The world's ending. Donald Trump was president, and then what ends up happening in response to that, like one of the most old school kind of neoliberal politicians comes back in the presidency. I mean, do you think that liberalism, and more specifically like neoliberalism, is here to stay? And what is the kind of trajectory, over the next few years of this? Because it just doesn't seem like, at least from my perspective, that it's going to tire itself out until something shifts it. But I'm curious what you think.
It's hard. I mean, it's very hard to predict the future. I mean, I would say, though, on the question of liberalism, it's it being tired out. I mean, I think it already is tired out. I think Joe Biden is the best demonstration of that, right? As we were saying before, 2020, the Democrats tried to kind of reignite liberalism, smash the reset button with all these candidates who they thought people were going to find really exciting, and people were going to take to the streets to elect Michael Bennett, or whatever it was, or John Delaney, or Pete Buttigieg, or Beto, and that didn't happen, right? I mean, they defeated the Sanders insurgency, but they did so by smashing the emergency glass and kind of like pulling out this guy who was a vehicle for nostalgia as much as anything else. A guy who, because of his association with Obama, people were, connected people kind of psychologically to this like more exciting moment that people still remember fondly, or some people do. And, he was, he was just, kind of old guard Democratic machine politician. And I don't think that, I think that in some ways it would have been, if Democrats had been able to actually get people excited about someone like Pete Buttigieg, say, instead of Biden, and they defeated Bernie in 2020, I think we'd have more to worry about. I mean, I'm not saying that, the next Bernie is definitely going to win or anything like that, or that, the ramparts of neoliberalism, we're suddenly going to overwhelm them or anything like that, in the next few years. But I don't think there's a lot of dynamism here. I think they really are running on empty. The Biden presidency was able to sustain people's excitement for no more than a few months, really, through these announcements and, through one large bill that I guess they passed in February of 2021, the rescue plan. And, I don't think the outlook in the midterms looks particularly good. I don't think, the Democratic leadership more specifically, like, I mean, it's so old and crumbly. I think I say in the book somewhere that it kind of reminds you of like Brezhnev era USSR, right? It reminds you of that stretch, the kind of like twilight of the USSR, where, before Gorbachev, there was like that 2-year stretch where there were like 5 guys that all became, premier or president or whatever the title was, and they all died within, a few months, or I don't remember if it was 5, but it was quite a few, right? They were just like cycling through all these old machine politicians, and no one could get the spluttering machine, to working again. And in the end, it fell to Gorbachev to kind of work out a negotiated, exit from that model, and, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here, but I certainly don't think that the outlook, at least in kind of the short and medium term, for either liberalism as a political force, or as a consensus. I don't think either is particularly good. And of course, part of that is also not just because they're being challenged from the left, but because they're being challenged from the right, which of course is something we have to worry about as well.
Totally.
Well, people should pre-order the book. We'll have a link below. I want to just say, I want to ask you one more thing. Luke
Sure.
is sort of, if people aren't familiar, is sort of like the rapid response for Jacobin, the sort of staff writing, constantly, responding to new political events, as they happen. It's very valuable, I think, work. I'm curious what your experience is like, packaging up your work like this into a coherent thesis. It reminds me, and I don't make this comparison lightly, but we've already mentioned the Tribune. George Orwell has a collection of essays called "As I Please," and this was during his World War II. He was writing this in London, and it's, people say 1984 or even homage to Catalonia. That's, I think, very interesting, Orwell. But it's interesting to read it after the fact. So I think this is, like I said, something people should pre-order and share with folks who aren't maybe as plugged into the Jacobin scene. But I'm just curious what your experience packaging this stuff up is like.
All right. Well, first off, thanks for the Orwell comparison. I hope reviewers see it that way as well. Let's get that from the New York Times review of books, and we'll be good to go. But Savage's prose, mix the best of Orwell with the best of James Baldwin, something like that. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked that, and it's interesting to think about. I mean, I should say that the book, I think, turned out better than I expected, and it didn't really come together like I expected, or like I had expected originally, because originally the idea was just, I'm going to take what I think are my best essays and put them in a book, right? And when I sat down to actually kind of curate them, I realized that if I organized them a certain way, they actually did tell a story. They told a bigger story, even though, some of them are just, as you said, these kind of pretty rapid responsey things that I wrote in, during the Democratic primaries, or, just in response to kind of events as they were unfolding. And yeah, in the end, I mean, I like to think the book does tell a coherent story about the moment we're living in, even though a lot of the subject matter, by the time it comes out this summer, is going to, topically speaking, is going to be a little, behind us. But I think in spite of that, it does, kind of tell a bigger story. And yeah, I suppose what I hadn't realized when I was, writing a lot of the pieces that originally appeared in Jacobin is that even if I was just reacting to something, as it was happening, in a somewhat narrow way, that was kind of the field work, right? Those were the initial observations that I think have informed, the larger arguments about the moment we're living in, and the politics of our moment. So yeah, it's interesting to think about. I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, it leads to, I think, a richness of detail that when you're trying to write about a period after the fact entirely, you miss out a lot of that stuff. So I think it's a really good synthesis of that. So The Dead Center: Reflections on Liberalism and Democracy After the End of History. Luke Savage, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, guys. This is great.
Yeah, folks.
That was a lot of fun. Luke's great, man.
Yeah, that was a really fun conversation. I honestly, there's so many essays in the book. I had a whole section on the fact-checking essay because, I always talk about my experience as a fact-checker. And but we could have gone on for, another hour and a half. Probably.
I mean, the book's coming out soon. There'll be another chance.
Yeah, we should. Definitely will need to just do that. But we'll put the link in. I think I forgot to put it so far, but I have the OR Books link. And I will put that in the show notes.
Yeah, and it's already down there below for folks if you're watching on
great.
YouTube. But well, before we get to this last segment, I just want to do one more pitch. Patreon.com/leftreckoning for 2 out of 3 of the things that you're missing. You're missing the post game and our Sunday shows. Sunday shows are where we interview people like our recent episode with Lillian Teixeira, talking about liberal rights and socialism. A lot of fun. We're able to go a little bit more in depth in those. Post games are fun. We hang out, take questions. And as always, let's plug the number where you can call 1940-289-7234 for that. And remember, folks, if you're listening in your solidarity tier, patron and above, tomorrow at 6 Central, we're going to be having our first virtual Left Reckoning spring meetup. So look for a post on Patreon to show up to that. We'd love to see y'all. Probably going to be over Zoom, I think.
Yeah, that's going to be
the easiest way to do it.
That's going to be fun. Yeah, as far as this Sunday, I think we'll maybe go back to our Marx reading series. So I'm not sure what's up, but maybe Thesis and Feuerbach, or I'm not sure what's up. I kind of want I'm a compulsive person, so like I like to go as chronologically as possible.
You're gonna have to make me put on my philosophy hat. It's been a little while for that one, but
I like making you put on your philosophy hat. Yeah, it's like a ring toss, but with a cowboy hat that says like philosophy on it.
Pull up my Rick Roderick. Well, yeah, y'all. So again, patreon.com/Left Reckoning for that. But we have one more segment for y'all, and I think it's gonna be a lot of fun. We're debuting something new. I'm sorry, Matt, you got to remind me of the title of it one more time.
It says, "What is crypto hiding?"
Dude, that's good. You should do that the whole show.
What is crypto hiding? Every time, often, maybe not every time. Sometimes it's just like to the moon. We want this to be much more valuable later, so we can cash out. Like that's the sort of I like those crypto guys that are just like, hey, if you're smart, put all your money in this coin, and you'll have $5 billion cash in 3 years. Like that's cool to me. When it's like, hey, we're going to solve a societal problem, because the issue is like those guys that simultaneously have enough money to blow on this speculation and are dumb enough to continue doing so. You run out of those guys after a certain point, and you need to start getting people that need to be convinced of like the technological advancement or the social sort of externalities that are going to be positive that these things can give you. So what's crypto hiding? This time we're talking about healthcare. And of course, we all know single payer healthcare, state healthcare, government controlled healthcare, free at the point of service for every person for any of your needs. Go to the hospital, get it checked out. That's what the goal is. And instead, we have, and I'm going to be basing a lot of this segment off of a great article on BuzzFeed News called,
this is something else, y'all, if you haven't seen this yet. This is peak like NFT Web3 brain.
There we go. So TikTok famous doctors are getting into NFTs, and it's a mess. Metadoc's NFTs were designed to, quote, revolutionize medicine. I mean, we talk about with Luke about Obama and the type of rhetoric he employed. I mean, there's just every huckster using this now. We're going to revolutionize medicine. But it's social media famous doctors can't prescribe or diagnose NFT holders. Now, just imagine that. Like, you need to be an NFT holder to get access to these doctors. But let's take it on its own terms for a little bit. A group of TikTok and Instagram famous physicians say they have a solution for the, quote, red tape of the current medical system. Now, there's already an ideological statement right there, right, David?
Well, what's the red tape, Matt?
Exactly. That's the thing.
The red tape is money. So, hey, have you had a problem affording healthcare? Well, here's another thing that's for profit that you probably can't afford. If you're somebody who's sort of locked out of the healthcare system right now, that's way stupider than just going to the doctor and just paying a bill directly.
Yeah. What gets rid of red tape in America is greenbacks. You put those down, and the red tape.
Now Ethereum. Now.
Oh my God! Yeah,
that's the revolution.
Yeah, that's the theory anyway. So these NFTs of cartoon doctors. Okay, so I'm not.
Could you imagine getting like? Could you imagine getting like a cancer diagnosis and then having to look at one of those little things?
Bro, I mean, that's why this is the perfect article to start this section on, because frankly, the last paragraph is an absolute like kicker. Because that is like, it's funny, but it's also, you realize like, oh shit, this is absolutely ghoulish that we're in this situation. But just to like pull back to the humorous bits for a bit, these NFTs called metadocs are supposed to give buyers access to real doctors. Access, that's an interesting Democrat word. Access to doctors, to real doctors, almost like a Web3 telehealth subscription, which, I mean, I remember some people saying, hey, Bitcoin might be something, blockchain, maybe even that's not anything, but Web3, that's where it's at. And I got to say, it seems all the same hokum. When Metadocs launched in December, it claimed that its legion of celebrity doctors who have a collective social media following of 70 million and have included Dr. Pimple Popper Sandra Lee and plastic surgeon Dr. Richard Brown of TikTok fame. Now, no offense to Dr. Pimple Popper and plastic surgery as like a field. That's not like, if I was going to get excited about some sort of venture like this, let's say I wasn't like a Marxist and like skeptical of any venture like this. I want to see some sort of like brain surgeon that isn't Ben Carson, and I want to see like somebody who's like done a lot of like other stuff than pop pimples and anyway, I'll stop taking shots at plastic surgery. Would be available via DM, group Ask Me Anything sessions, or one-on-one video chats to those who buy in. Metadocs founder Dr. Sina Jurabchi hopes it will evolve into a full-fledged virtual clinic in the so-called metaverse. Again, more meta stuff. This is
yeah.
Like,
This is just like a more expensive version of WebMD, effectively.
Right. Yeah, and with the new like sort of fad of the month technology whacked on top of it. And like this stuff seems kind of marginal, but this is like Facebook's entire future strategy.
That's true.
Where patients can put on a haptic suit and be examined remotely by a physician in virtual reality. That seems interesting. I don't know if I would get in line for that haptic suit. But now Metadocs is facing backlash from the meta community, in part because it is not actually licensed as a telemedicine service.
Surprise.
And thus, so much for that, like cutting through the red tape. It's actually like, no, red tape of like, are you able to write prescriptions?
Do you have a license in the state, or did you get taken away for putting out like quack theories on folks?
Yeah, and do you mainly like produce YouTube content or TikTok videos? And thus, its doctors cannot legally make diagnoses, write prescriptions, or give personalized medical advice to anyone who buys a Metadocs NFT. A further wrinkle: doctors are almost always required to be licensed in a state in order to practice there, including through telehealth services. At this point, we're hesitant to refer to anybody as a patient, says Dr. Dustin Portella, a Metadocs physician and practicing dermatologist, told BuzzFeed. Now, dermatology is kind of one that plausibly makes sense. I don't know why you have to combine it with NFTs. Maybe like the government should have like sort of telehealth doctors, right? According to a recent white paper, the pre-sale cost of a Metadocs NFT, blah blah blah. But why would somebody pay hundreds of dollars for a cartoon so they could ask a doctor if they are not seeking some form of medical advice? I mean, it's sad. It's funny and sad. Jurabchi, an ear, nose, and throat and facial plastics doctor who refers to himself as a, quote, medical infotainment provider.
Oh, hell yeah.
Which, that's great. Believes the Metadocs NFTs offer other benefits. Value isn't just medical care, he said. Our deliverable is connecting people with these doctors for a value of whatever they want to talk about or connect with. Yeah, so it's like you just want to hang with some doctors. I don't want just like for the vibes that they put off.
No, I mean it's dark. I mean it's they'll start Patreon next, Substacks.
Yeah, exactly. Jurabchi has 1.9 million TikTok followers. Damn, and he's a recent crypto convert. Now, I think this guy. This is like the sickness of society because I genuinely think this guy is just a bit naive. And well capitalized because he's a doctor with a large social media following. And yeah, I mean, maybe I'm giving too much credit. Like Medicare for All isn't exactly like an obscure idea. But anyway, let me continue. It said he's a recent crypto convert, quote, getting really into NFTs after investing in the popular Stoner Hats collection. I had never heard of it. Popular stoner cats, and I'm a stoner and I like cats, collection backed by Ethereum co-founder Vitalik Buterin and actor Mila Kunis. His wife suggested pursuing a homegrown NFT venture, so Jurabchi combined his two main interests, medicine and crypto, right? I mean, you can... I'm probably not the only guy to even think of something like this. Metadocs mechanisms are outlined in its white paper, which explains a system where NFT buyers will receive, quote, heart tokens for each day they own a Metadocs NFT. Tokens can be redeemed for 3 tiers of doctor, quote, experiences. Sorry. Doctor, I mean, don't let the Democrats hear about this terminology because they'll be like, well, I got to give you a doctor experience. The doctor experiences from DMs to ask me anythings to video chats. The MetaDocs website also states that NFT holders will receive discounts on selected apparel. Oh, that's super fun. Personal care products, medical testing, health supplements, and much more. Yeah, those supplements, baby. Got a couple more here. So far, many user interactions with doctors have happened in a now deleted Ask a Doctor chat within the project's Discord, where hundreds of users referred to as patients could solicit advice from MetaDocs physicians. Users posted questions about the harms of performance-enhancing drugs, what to say to someone who is dying, and whether they should be concerned about internal organ pain. Now, that one, they see a doctor. In March, one member asked about the effect of diet sweeteners. A MetaDocs doctor identifying as Dr. Shane Williams, a family medicine doctor in Florida, responded that the general consensus is that these could lead to issues down the line, potential GI cancer. I don't have the research to back it up, just going off of what I've heard through the grapevine.
So effectively, I mean, you pay $570 to be told to do your own research.
And maybe go to see a doctor. Is this... okay, there's a couple more here. According to a white paper, MetaDocs plan to launch virtual clinics that will be accessible to those in underserved third world communities. Now, the article makes exactly the point we would want to. Elizabeth Ramirez, a professor of tech ethics at Notre Dame University, compared MetaDocs' plan to WorldCoin, the crypto project collecting millions of iris scans from countries across the world in exchange for valueless cryptocurrency. Why is it always the same playbook? Because the laws are not there and the jurisdiction is not there to hold it accountable, she said. I mean, it's just despicable, too, because that is a selling point and something they're exploiting at the same time.
No, I mean, it's so nasty because, like, I'm not a medical expert, so, take what I say with a grain of salt, but, like, there's a lot of promise in sort of, telehealth, particularly in like reaching people in, like, I know in rural America, because it's easier to get, kind of basic checkup or get some questions or maybe get something looked at without having to drive 3 hours or whatever it is to get to a hospital. I'd imagine, in certain areas too, like it could be, helpful as well. Again, I'm not an expert and I'm sure there's a lot of weird nonsense that goes along with that too. But it's truly amazing that something that could potentially be helpful, the people who are sort of sprinting to the front are just the biggest scammers trying to look for a place where there's effectively no laws.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a great final paragraph, which I think puts the stakes here. For early MetaDocs supporters, the injustices of the current healthcare system could be what's pushing them toward untested and unproven alternatives. Whether crypto can provide a solution to medical inequality and quickly is a gamble they might be willing to take. Quote, how do I sign up my uncle to get some of the money? One anonymous Discord user wrote, he might not make it much longer. And I mean,
yeah. I mean, that's heavy. And that's why, these things go from being comical to really depressing fast, because people are looking for solutions, because it is hard to get, to go see a doctor if you're feeling sick, if you're young and are working and you don't have health care. It's worrying. You might have something that feels a little off. It could be something serious. It could be something minor. And you have to make that decision. The gamble basically is like, well, I either put money I don't have towards like treatment or investigation, or I just sort of sit on it and pray that nothing bad happens. And the sad thing about the whole situation right now, and this is like, not to be preaching or anything, but like, this is like why I'm a socialist, because it's like, it's so disgusting that we're at a point now, technologically and scientifically, where we can catch a lot of things that killed a lot of people in their youth and early on in life. But instead of actually being able to like enjoy that human accomplishment, to keep people safe, it is just a world that is filled with like the biggest scammers, and unnecessary. You want to talk about red tape, as we were saying earlier, the red tape is the whole for-profit healthcare system, right? You can still take care of doctors. You can still make sure people are living a good life or providing those services without doing it in a way that's exclusive or encourages this kind of extremely, really nasty, taking advantage of folks. who, as that last person was saying, is like, really just looking for a solution where there are not a lot of them. I mean, the same thing goes for like quack doctors too. If you grow up working class, I know like those groups like really prey on poor and working people, to say, oh, we're going to give you, apricot seed extract to deal with, your cancer because, some insane conspiracy theory, charge you an arm and a leg for the extract itself. I mean, it just is like the depravity of the system thrown right in our face. And two, I mean, like, I might make a point that might annoy some folks, but the thing about like this NFT thing, the crypto Web3 in general, and like even like the kind of willingness for a lot of these, people who are signing up on the doctor side for this thing is this. It's like, I ain't saying this in some ways like, oh, I'm smarter than anybody else or anything like that. But, you dedicate your life to a very specific study, right? And you sometimes haven't developed the capacity or the knowledge into other things, mainly like politics and general economics, to get that these things are extremely scammy. Do you get what I mean? Like if you've been studying like the human body for 15 years, like I'm not saying that just because of that you're ignorant of other things, but like there is a way that you can sort of get by without having to expose yourself to these things. And that's why you see so many of these people who like are incredibly smart and talented in some aspects just be complete rubes and tools for like these really nasty speculators on this end.
Yeah. And I mean, often it's their agency. I think it's CAA, the agency. I wonder if Mila Kunis is that one that's been doing all of the crypto stuff, been getting all the talent on it, basically to commodify the attention. But I was watching Andre Iguodala on Draymond Green's YouTube show, Draymond Green of the Golden State Warriors, and I wonder if I have it. Anyway, I'll just summarize. Basically, like a lot of these guys are into crypto, and Iguodala was given the pitch. Draymond's like, I'm a little bit skeptical. I'm trying to learn. Tell me about it, right? And Iguodala gave him a little pitch, and then at the end, he's like, one thing that's kind of crazy how it worked out was I got robbed, and he's like, I gave my password to somebody I shouldn't have, and all of a sudden they had my account, and I lost $25,000. And then he said, then the crypto community sort of convinced him, like one of the crypto boosters that he like was talking to said, you just got your degree in NFTs because that's why you got to be secure with all this stuff.
Oh my God.
Right. And it's like, and Iguodala literally in that interview says, we're used to, he says what you say, we're used to elevating ourselves and being competent, right? Like the Golden State Warriors, particularly, probably one of the smartest teams in basketball history. Like they're just smarter than other teams on the court, and that's like something you should look up is like the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is if you have some sort of high competence in one field, you assume that competence translates to areas you don't know the details about at all. And all these people are sharks, and they have their teeth in a lot of different places now. And I'm worried, like when like this stuff, I don't know. I think it's going to go up faster than, and I typically don't make predictions about that, but it just seems so everywhere now. And at what point does it realize that this isn't creating any sort of value? But
well, hopefully sooner rather than later, and hopefully less and less normal people get caught up in it because it very clearly is a house of cards.
Especially with all those different types of celebrities promoting it, right? Like this NFT guy we're talking about that did NFT doctors. It was Mila Kunis that like got her into it. Actually, I found the thing. If you can just fill for a second here, I found the Draymond.
That'd be great. I mean, it's I think it gets even worse though with like the Silicon Valley folks because people spend a lot of time too getting, as I was saying, with doctors, like a lot of technical expertise on like how to run systems and how to create products that work, function well, look beautiful, and all of that. And they think that all of the world's problems and all of its history is sort of common sense. Where I'll just tell you as somebody, look, I'm not a PhD or an expert in all this kind of stuff, but there are plenty of things that I think I have a good grasp of even. right? And then you go back and revisit the history, and it's so much more rich and textured than you thought, right? And like the point is to have like a little bit of humility, but that's not how you rise to the top in those communities, right? And this is like what we're seeing, I think, from like some of the things that people have seen internally within like Facebook and Twitter that's caused such an uproar of how those companies were being run internally. We're starting to see more and more of that like spilling off into like the public world, if you get what I mean. That kind of Silicon Valley, like, oh, I'm an expert because like I'm really skilled at one set of things. Well, everything else must be a similar kind of problem that I can take the same kind of mentality to. I mean, that's why you get bullshit about like the only thing that's stopping Palestinians from having, a thriving society is not apartheid, it's not occupation, is that they don't have some bullshit cryptocurrency, right? That's an ideology that is absurd on its face, but you can see if somebody has sort of been brought up in a world and have seen success from a kind of, I'm smarter than you, I've already sort of been able to figure out and reckon with most of life's problems, that it's, that's a very easy trap to fall into.
Yeah. Here's this clip.
It is what it is, and you live and you learn. And that's kind of where I am in the space, is just continuing to learn, trying to get more active in the space, but also I want to thoroughly understand it before I just get super active into it, and so that's what I've been trying to do. But no, go ahead.
The funny thing is, the best thing that happened to me is my account got hacked. I got robbed. Like, it's funny that it happened like that, but so.
Oh, crap.
If you click warning for everybody, don't click on anything in Discord. Like, don't click anything, like in terms of like links, right? So I'm just trying to learn. You know how we are. Like, we know how to work hard. We watch hours and hours of film. So it's nothing to us to study. Like, it's easy for us to pick up on stuff. That's why people say, like, like athletes, we could transition to different places because like we just learn how to work hard and, obtain information. So I'm just learning, clicking on stuff, and I clicked on the wrong thing. Somebody, got access to my account, and then I accidentally screenshot my passwords to my wallet, and then they go into my cloud, got that too, boom, take my stuff, right? But that right there, I ended up losing like $25,000, but I talked to somebody in the community showed up for me and showed me how to get everything back. I would get everything back to square, whatever. I still lost, but he was like, think about it as you just went to school and you just got your degree in NFTs. And I was like, wow. Because now I'm able to teach other people, do this, do that, move like this, move like that. All right, watch out for this, watch out for that. Even with like some of the projects that aren't that good, I got some projects that's like, I wouldn't have did that if I could do it again. But now I just give it the same information to other people. So I say the best thing to do is just buy one thing, just like watch it. That experience alone will teach you so much than, one person can tell you.
And it's like, it's such an example because like, I think his intentions are as pure as you can get, right? I honestly think like he thinks like this is helping people out. And because this is what we're told, like invest wisely and you can take care of your like family in the future, right? And instead, like he takes a lesson from like being himself robbed. And and then like going to the community and they help him get back to square, whatever that means. And it didn't get everything back.
Didn't get him the money back though.
And guess what? Like most people will not be, the community is more incentivized to help out a very famous celebrity who might bad talk it if something went wrong than they are Joe Schmo, regardless if it's $25,000, $5,000 or something like that. And it's so dangerous because like that goes out to like 100,000 people and people get the message that this is like what I need to do. It's if I have some spare money and I want to invest it wisely for my future, and you put it in like shark infested waters.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like, again, like what problem is this shit solving? If this is supposed to be making money for people, right? Or like helping folks out, what problem is it solving where it's like, well, to learn how to do this properly, you first need to lose $25,000 to scammers to really know how to do this shit, right? Like it's creating insanely unnecessary hurdles for people in the first bit.
Yeah. I mean, I guess their response would be like, look at the price of college education. Like $25,000 would be a bargain in some places, but
Lord help us all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, folks, we're going to talk Elon. In the post game, I'm excited. Got a lot of stray thoughts about the guy who might be backing out of the deal now. I think that might be a little bit premature to say that. My assumption is he's still going to do it. I don't know. Where are you at?
We'll have to see. I mean, we should save that for the post game, but I'll tell folks right now that the deal that he's using to finance this thing is absolutely bonkers. So more on that in the post game, plus questions from the Discord and voicemails. You can always leave us at 1-940-289-7234. Sign up at patreon.com/leftreckoning. We'll see you all in just a little bit.
Oh yeah, let's add this.